see what the voice looks like. I will keep my New York accent just so as to not disorient you as we go along. I was, however, born in Youngstown, Ohio. It's just that nothing stuck in Youngstown, Ohio. And once we left, as you probably know if you visited there, it's been all downhill since. Youngstown is one of those cities about which the capitalist system would like you to think nothing about it, because if you faced it, you'd understand what the cost of this kind of an economic system is. But then again, what's true about Youngstown is also true of Cleveland, Detroit, and many other places that we'll have something to say about as we go on this evening. Let me begin with a couple of comments about favors I need to ask you before we jump into the topic. The first one is that as I go along and describe what happened, what could happen in our economic system, there may be moments when what you hear is distressing or depressing or horrible. And I want you to remember, I didn't cause anything. I'm just the messenger. And there's an old rule that it's not good to hurt the messenger just because you don't like the message. And there is an easy alternative if the things I say trouble you about the economy we live in. The thing you can do is tune me out and resume watching radio and television reports in the mass media, and none of these troubling insights will disturb your sleep or your waking up. That's always an option. The second caveat, or the second qualification before I jump in, is that I have found in my life that doing a little history tends to focus people on what matters. And so I'm going to ask your indulgence that we do a little history about the breakdowns of our economic system, so you don't think that what's happening now is the first time or the only time, that you understand that we're in yet another of an endlessly recurring set of problems that are part of and endemic to this economic system, which has that name, capitalism. We do have to call it by what it is. And we have a historical problem in the United States. We have been afraid, there's no other nice way to put this, we've been afraid for half a century, basically since the end of World War II, to talk about our economic system in anything remotely like a reasonable way, to talk about its strengths and its weaknesses, how it's developing, whether we're pleased or displeased by how it's developed. We haven't done that. We fight as a nation in a healthy way about our school systems and our energy systems, our housing systems. We spent the last several years fighting and arguing about the strengths and weaknesses of our medical insurance system. We really do talk about our system. My goodness, we even debate what marriage is. That's amazing. That's healthy. A healthy society interrogates its own systems, figures out what's strong and weak, and then tries to fix what's wrong with it. That's in fact how you make human progress. But we didn't do that with our economic system. We just didn't. What we did instead was fight a cold ideological war in which we were the good guys and the Soviet Union and so forth were the bad guys. And the way we handled that was, I'll be polite, immature. They were bad, and we were good. Capitalism was great, and socialism was awful. How awful? Unspeakably awful. And therefore, you couldn't criticize capitalism, because to do so indicated either a weak brain or disloyalty. And that scared an awful lot of people. And to drive the point home, as I'll show you in a few minutes, really became a pressure in our country that nobody escaped, and that sank deep into the American consciousness. So it's hard to talk about capitalism, not because we're not smart enough, we are as a people, and not because it isn't important, it's as important as anything, but because for 50 years it was a taboo. We couldn't. So it's hard for us to do it, but I'm determined to help each and every one of you rise to the occasion and become able to do this, and I'm going to work real hard to do it. Okay, let's go. History first. Capitalism is a stunningly unstable system. From its beginnings in Britain, the 18th century, all the way through its spread to the rest of Europe and to North America, Japan, and eventually global. Wherever capitalism has become the dominant system, it brings stunning instability. Every 4 to 7 years, there's an economic downturn. What does that mean? Millions of people are thrown out of work. Not because they aren't skilled, not because what they produce isn't important, none of it. It's just the way the system works. Sometimes the downturns are short and shallow. They don't last long, they don't affect many people. Other times, they are doozies. They affect millions, and they last a long time. But the instability is what I want you to focus on. This crazy process in which people can't be sure of their work, of their job, of their income, and of all that those things mean in everybody's life. I use humor, as you know, as much as I can, partly to make it easier to swallow what might otherwise not taste so good. So I will try it again. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. Or you would have asked your roommate to get some professional help. But you live with an economic system, and you do neither of those things. And you ought to wonder to yourself, why? Why we as a people do that. The worst collapse of capitalism, at least so far, happened in the 1930s. I want to make sure you all know about that and what happened. We are now living in the second worst downturn. The worst one starts in 1929 and doesn't end until 1941. 11 years. We're only about halfway to that record now. And it was worse. 1933, the official unemployment rate in the United States, 25%. 5 times, roughly, what it is today. Really bad then. Our president at the time, Roosevelt, gave a famous speech in which he said 1/3 of Americans go to bed hungry, ill-clothed, ill-fed, ill-housed. 1/3. Things were grim. Grimmer than they are now. But the American people reacted differently from the way they have, at least so far this time. Just a reminder. Millions of Americans decided to do something, not to be passive, and not to try to solve the problem of a broken, dysfunctional economic system by a personal decision. Very American. Problem is social, I'm going to solve it as an individual. You can't solve social problems as individuals. The way to solve a social problem is with a social movement. All of history teaches this 1,000 times. And in the 1930s, Americans got that. They reacted collectively, socially, real quickly. Most amazing, they joined labor unions. Millions of people in the 1930s joined labor unions. These were people who had never been in a union before, whose parents had never been in a union. It was incredible. It was the greatest unionization wave that the United States has ever seen. We've never had anything like it before, we've never had anything like it since. And the answer, why? Simple. Americans felt that banding together with other workers was your best hope to get through that awful depression in better shape than if you tried to do it on your own. Collective action, joining an organization, was the act that Americans took. Helping them to go in that direction in the 1930s were two other organizations that Americans joined in huge numbers. Socialist parties, actually two of them, and the American Communist Party. I know for some of you this may be a little difficult, but yes, Americans joined socialist and communist parties in big numbers. And the socialists and the communists were the militants who brought millions of people into the labor movements, cooperating with John L. Lewis and the mine workers and the others that were the leaders of the movement then called CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations. And they went to the president once they had done all this, and they demanded a meeting with Mr. Roosevelt. And he was an astute politician, so he met, and they basically told him, politely, that he had to do something for the mass of the American people, that they were suffering way too much, it wasn't tolerable anymore, and something had to be done. And the union folks kept saying, you've got to do something for the mass of people. The socialists and the communists, they went a little further. They said, you better do something for the mass of the people, or else. And when he raised his eyebrow, he was a very polite fellow, when he raised his eyebrow and asked what did what else mean, they asked him if he remembered what had happened in Russia not that many years earlier, which he certainly did. This was a little bit of an arrangement. The unions, the socialists, and the communists had arranged to play good cop, bad cop, so that the unions would be cooperative and the socialists and communists obstreperous. But Roosevelt knew it didn't matter. What they were saying to him was, if you ever want to be elected again, Mr. President, you've got to do something, because we're not going to vote for you if you don't. And there may be worse. Roosevelt knew they weren't kidding. He knew what he was dealing with. So he went back and talked to the rich and the corporate leaders. He knew them well because he comes from that part of America. His family was very well connected. He went to all the right schools, etc., etc. And he said to the corporations and the rich, basically describing to them the meeting he had had with the unions and the socialists and the communists. And he said, here's what I think has to happen. We have to do something for the mass of people. We have to do it because if we don't, there'll be a revolution, which I assume you gentlemen don't want. He said gentlemen since the number of women in that group was unbelievably small. The best bet, he said to them, is that we can stave off a revolution if we do something for the mass of people. But here's the problem, gentlemen. The government has no money. You see, when millions of people are unemployed, they don't earn anything, and if they don't earn anything, they can't pay taxes, So the city governments and the state governments and the federal governments had no money, just like today. So how am I going to do something for the mass of people if the government has no money? Well, luckily, you and I both know the answer, he said, staring at them. You've got the money, and you're going to give it to me to take care of the mass of the people. Because if you don't give me a lot of your money to do that, you won't have any money to give anybody. Think it over. You've got 6, maybe 7 minutes. He made them very angry. He really did. Half of the men in that room didn't believe it, thought he was bluffing, and even if he wasn't, the communists, socialists, and unions were bluffing. They wanted to tough it out. Those are the forerunners of the Koch brothers. That's who they are. Literally, it's the same family. But the other half were persuaded by Roosevelt. They better give him some of their money in order to keep the rest, to keep their basic social position by forking over a big chunk of what they had. And that was all Roosevelt needed. He went back to the communists, socialists, and the unions, and he said, okay, now we got a deal here. I am going to take care of the mass of people suffering through this depression, just like you asked me. But you've got to stop all this crap about revolution and socialism and communism. You've got to be satisfied that we're going to do something for the mass of people, and I promise you it'll be more than you expected you'd ever get. Okay, said the CIO, and the socialists, and the communists. They went for that deal. Not every one, there were always some who were not satisfied, but in general, they all went along. And Roosevelt was good for his word. He did what this deal implied. Very quickly, but to remind you, so we're all on the same page. He created the Social Security system. In the middle of a depression, when the government had no money, the president went on the radio and said, I'm giving every person 65 years of age or older a check every month for the rest of their lives. That's it. They don't have to do anything. We never had such a thing in this country. A very expensive program when the government had no money. He knew where he was going to get the money. No sooner was that done, he declared, also for the first time in American history, an unemployment compensation system. You lose your job through no fault of your own, the government will give you a check every week for half a year, to help you navigate this situation. This is at a time when the government has no money and millions of people are unemployed who are going to get these checks. In order to help the average person, if they're lucky enough to have a job, they created the first minimum wage in the United States. Roosevelt did that. What was all that argument about? If you raise the minimum wage, young people are not going to get a job. Cut no ice at all, that message at that time. He erased it. And then came the biggest program of all. Roosevelt goes on the radio, no TV yet, and says to the American people, if the private sector either cannot or will not employ the millions of Americans who only ask for a job that they can do, then there's no alternative but for me as president to do it. Notice the logic. If there's unemployed people and the private sector doesn't hire them, then the government will. A, B, C. Think about it, because we've just gone through 8 years of horrible unemployment and no leading politician, neither of the Democrats nor the Republicans, has come forward and said, let's do that. Between 1934 and 41, Roosevelt created and filled 15 million jobs. 15 million families that didn't lose their home because they couldn't maintain their mortgage, that didn't feel terrible about themselves, that didn't fall apart from the stress and the strain. Remember John Steinbeck and all the rest. Amazing what he did. And he made the corporations and the rich people pay taxes way higher than they had before. This is America 2015, so I have to say that again. He taxed corporations and the rich big time to deliver services to the mass of middle income and poor people. So anyone who tells you that can't be done in the United States doesn't know our history. Anyone who tells you something like that, namely, I'd love to do that, but I can't because it's political suicide to tax rich people and help average people. Let's see what happened to Franklin Roosevelt, the politician who did it. He was re-elected to the presidency 3 times. He's the most popular president in American history. Nobody's even close. Did he get punished for taxing the rich and helping everybody? The opposite. He became invincible. It was only after Roosevelt died at the end of World War II that the Republicans could push through the law that limits any president to 2 terms, which is why Obama is done at the end of his term. They didn't want that to happen again. They didn't want somebody else to become permanent president until he died because he taxed the rich. And again, just so you know the numbers, since sometimes they help. In 1944, Roosevelt's still the president, State of the Union message delivered to Congress. I, the president, he writes this message, propose that the top rate of taxation for the richest Americans be set at 100%. If you didn't know that, ask yourself why you don't know that part of our history. And here's what that meant. Every dollar over $25,000 per year, that was the top bracket. Every dollar over $25,000, Roosevelt proposal said that you earned, the tax rate would be 100%. That is, for every dollar over $25,000 you earned, you'd have to give Uncle Sam that dollar. You get to keep nothing. That's called a maximum income proposal, because that's what it does. It basically says you can earn up to $25,000, and that's it, sweetie pie. You're done. Be about $400,000 now per year to be the rough equivalent. Wow. The president proposed that. Went to Congress, Republicans went ballistic, you know, the usual theater that passes for politics in our country. And when the dust cleared and they yelled at each other and all the rest, the Republicans and the Democrats agreed, and the president signed into law what the top bracket would be, 94%. That's what we agreed to as a nation. Every dollar over $25,000, you get to keep 6 cents, and the other 94 cents go to Washington. The top bracket remained in the 90s, all through the 1940s, all through the 1950s, and all through the 1960s. Are you with me?